Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and your host. Each program we talk about issues that are important for elections. We hope to inspire you to talk about those same issues. And when election time comes around, we want to help you be ready and willing to go vote. Today we're going to talk about political messaging, and our guest is John Kretschmar, who's the director of the Brenner Institute for Labor Studies at UNO. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me. Thank you
Great.
for your interest.
So tell us a little bit about your background before we get into talking about political messaging.
I grew up in the Detroit area at a wonderful time. The Big Three was booming. They were making lots of cars, and good jobs made strong communities. And it was also a time when Motown music was just coming, so I was doubly blessed that way. After getting a bachelor's degree, I was a substitute teacher in the south side of Chicago for a year. Found out that I didn't know a lot. My education had prepared me for the reality I'd seen. So moved back to Detroit, did some work at a place called the Interfaith Centers for Racial Justice. Then went to work in those auto factories to earn money for graduate school, got a master's in social work, and after spending a year getting a professor his job back, he was denied tenure for a political reason, I came to Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay. Well, let's first of all talk about what is political messaging. I mean, you hear that term and you think you know what it means. It's like, so does it mean government? It means politics. What does that mean?
Well, anything dealing with politics is political messaging. Now, the question is, how do you get your message across to people so that, first of all, they can hear it, and second of all, take it in and evaluate it and maybe make some decisions about it? Political messaging is nothing more than using words to get your point across. A lot of people think of it as, I think the term is spin. It's a negative term, where you'll see a talking head on Sunday morning ask a question to a candidate. The candidate will deftly dodge that question and say whatever the heck they want to get their message across rather than respond to the question. That's a lot of political messaging. I love watching Sunday morning shows for that stuff.
Okay. People talk about framing messages, but before we get to that, you've talked about framing your view of government. So why don't you talk about that, framing government?
Right. Government and political messaging are hand in glove with one another, and you cannot have an intelligent conversation with someone about political messaging without first getting government out of the way. And since President Reagan, the question has always been, and the debate has always been, is government too big or too small? And that stays with us today, 30 years later. The issue, in my mind, is not whether it's too big or too small. That's a waste of time to use that frame to discuss government. The frame that I use, and I've used it in Nebraska with some good success. I've talked to a number of relatively conservative people, and I've said basically that all forms of government in our democratic republic have a moral responsibility to use our commonwealth in ways that protect and empower all of us equally. And if I can get people to buy into that frame of what government's job is, what its responsibility is, what its moral mandate is, then discussions focus not on whether it's too big or too small, but is this a legitimate empowerment function? Is this a legitimate protection function? And when you start talking about programs and what they do or don't do for the general public, for all of us equally, that's a much better place to be. So I'm a big believer in we've got to get away from too big or too small and focus more on what are the legitimate responsibilities or mandates of government.
Okay, so you're saying that there can be really a common ground or common view, whether you're conservative or whether you consider yourself liberal, progressive.
I think that's absolutely the case. If you start with that definition, then you can actually talk about meat and potatoes stuff. And that's where we should be talking.
Okay. So what goes into political messages then in framing them, once you have that basic view of framing government?
When you frame a message, you consciously choose everything that's in that message. Everything that's in a message has to be important. You want the listener, the viewer, to see it. And you will intentionally exclude everything from that message that you don't want the listener or viewer to think about. Much as somebody who's an artist and paints a painting, right? They get to decide the viewpoint, how many people are going to be in it, what colors they're going to use, how large, how small, everything that goes into that painting, the painter intentionally frames. With political messaging, it's the same deal. Absolutely the same deal.
Okay. So how do you appeal to core groups or demographics and values? How do you do that in a message? It's word choice, for one thing.
Well, there's a guy named Frank Luntz, who is a conservative wordsmith. He wrote a book, and I'm going to mangle the title. I think it's something like, "It's not what you say, it's what they hear." And he has run focus groups forever to try and find out the best words, the best phrases, the best that will resonate the most with folks. And he's incredibly strong. In fact, he's one of the pioneers with the control dials. You'll watch those debates and you'll see people's happiness ratings go up and down. They'll have one line for conservatives, another for liberals or progressives, right?
Right.
And the reason he does that is there is an interplay between the limbic area of your brain and your emotional well-being. Logic has nothing to do with that. So he is getting gut instinct. In most focus groups, they will ask you for how do you feel about it, and you put it into words. With the little dial, you are getting instant feedback, and it's gut feedback. There's no intervening words along the way. So he's a pretty impressive fellow, but choosing words and choosing phrases is not message framing in my point of view, the way I talk about it. Message framing starts with finding a core set of values and then finding a way to bring those values to fore. So if you, for instance, chose to listen to AM talk radio, and I'm a big fan of AM talk radio. My wife doesn't like to get in the car with me when we drive anywhere because I'll have the AM radio on and she'll say, not doing that. I said, but you want to know how those people who might not be on the same bus as you are using their messaging. What are they appealing to? Who are they trying to get? What are the images? What are the values they're trying to impart? And it's incredibly important to understand values because let's talk a little bit about how the brain works and processes information. All thought is physical. That means that when a word is said or you have a smell of something or you see something, instantaneously and below the level of your awareness, your brain is already working on the project. All neurons neurons that fire together wire together. The more often they fire, the deeper and stronger the connections become. So all thought is physical, and neurons that fire together wire together. And we know this works because you and I at one time probably had flip cards for foreign languages and or multiplication tables. And the first 6 times we flipped over that 4 times 8. But after a while, you had it down. You knew that it was 32, right?
Right.
So the more a message is repeated, the deeper it goes into our head, whether we want it there or not. And conservative messaging, in particular, has been brilliant, and it's been going on for 40 years. Coming out of World War II, unions had and liberals had a pretty good go of it. John Kennedy referred to himself as a liberal. Liberal was a good word. John Kennedy was followed by LBJ. LBJ soundly defeated a guy named Barry Goldwater, who was a conservative. Conservatives were bad, liberals were good. That had to change. And in 1971, a guy named Lewis Powell wrote a memo to the Chamber of Commerce, and that memo became the basis for what we now call think tanks. The Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, ALEC, were all born out of that 1971 message. And they wanted to get the best and brightest conservative thinkers and talkers who would find a way to capture the hearts and minds of the public once again. And it's been doing they've been doing a very good job, I would say, for 40 years. And so the conservative message about government, it needs to be smaller, we need less regulation, and we need to unleash the power that is the free enterprise system. That's basic. Of course, we also need police and fire and the military. That's their overarching frame. They've used it for 40 years. And every issue, every conservative issue that I can think of fits neatly into that overall frame, that long, oft-repeated frame. So even a progressive, and there are a few in Nebraska, even a progressive knows conservative talking points, knows that conservative frame. Unfortunately, liberals and progressives don't have anything near that, anything close to that.
Okay. So no example at all that we can really come up with that's kind of universal?
If in my messaging, I work with unions, and so I am forever talking about creating a more fair and more just society. And fairness and justice is something that we learn when we're knee-high to a grasshopper. It's a natural outcome of the golden rule, isn't it? So we have that. So if you put a frame together talking about fairness and justice, it'll resonate with lots and lots of folks because of those early understandings that those are good things, not bad things. In fact, I listened to Laura Ingraham once talk about, can't we get away from this fairness stuff? I mean, it's such a confusing word. And it's really, you know, it's capturing young minds, and we've got to get away to. So it works. It does resonate with a lot of folks, and it makes some conservatives unhappy or uncomfortable.
Okay. We talked a little bit about how the brain works in looking at messaging, and I know there have been some studies that say people who identify as conservative versus liberal, progressive, their brains are actually wired differently.
Do you want
to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I've read a couple articles about that, and basically the distinction between being a conservative and a liberal, now let's go back to how they figure this out. There's something called functional MRIs. So they are literally able to look at your brain when you are presented with different stimuli. And you can see where the electrical activity is in your brain. And so when they show the same material to liberals and conservatives when they're in an MRI, they see that certain parts of the brain in conservatives get pretty concerned when they're presented with new, different, unfamiliar material. They like, evidently, more than liberals who are willing to try new and different things. Conservatives are more, I want meat and potatoes. I don't want anything different. I like the way it is now. Don't rock the boat. Mm-hmm. And that seems fairly consistent with the way I understand the political philosophy as well. Conservatives want to maintain the status quo. They don't want to take people who've been marginalized and necessarily give them rights that they didn't have before. So that I would say that the Republican Party, when it was formed, was a liberal party, and the Democratic Party, back in the same time, was a conservative party. They liked the status quo. They thought chattel slavery was working just fine for them, whereas the Republicans were saying, nah, not so much. We got to change that, which is a liberal point of view in my mind.
Okay. Let's talk about, in messaging, emotional versus rational messages. And that how those are used? And
let's go back to the way the brain is working. Again, the fMRIs show that we have two areas of the brain that are typically engaged in plotting a course of action for ourselves. One, the older one, is the limbic area of the brain, which is where all our sensory input registers first. It's where our emotion is kept. It's where our long-term memory is kept. Some might say it's where our core values or our common sense is kept. Then we have the neocortex, more recently developed part of the brain. It's the convoluted stuff that we see when we look at a picture of the brain. And that's where our language is. That's where our reasoning ability is. And you have to have the two, the limbic area and the neocortex, on the same page if you are going to be successful in charting a course for yourself. You and I might have, at least I know I have, made numerous New Year's Eve resolutions about what the new year was going to bring for me. Some of them have dealt with weight control. And for 2 weeks, right, I'm there, I'm on it. But it was purely a rational idea. I know where I am, rationally I know that this isn't good for me, I need to stop carrying this stuff, so let's get to the gym. But if the limbic area doesn't buy in, you're in trouble. The neocortex provides the roadmap, the limbic area provides the motivation to actually follow through on that stuff. So you need to have a message that resonates in both areas if you're going to do something. A message. The single most powerful message that moved me in my youth was Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. He gave it to 250,000 people in '63 at a March for Jobs and Freedom. We don't know necessarily the march was organized by a guy named A. Philip Randolph, who is an executive vice president of the AFL-CIO, but we do remember it for an I Have a Dream speech. And Dr. King gave a speech that was wrapped, enveloped in values, both in American values. He makes a note that the African Americans had been given a check for their rights, but it was returned for insufficient funds. So he referred to our founding values, the Declaration of Independence, where we are all endowed with inalienable rights. And he said, you know, we need to become that nation. We need to make that check good. And of course, as a Christian minister, he wrapped himself in Christian values as well. And so Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech was powerful in that he spoke to values that Americans loved and valued and kept dear. And it wasn't just for the 250,000 people there, it was for all the people who would watch it and see it afterwards so that they would be touched as well. Sadly, if a progressive or a liberal gave the speech today, it would be, I have a 10-point plan speech. Were there facts and details and data back there that showed that institutional racism was severely disadvantaging one group over the other? Which, of course there was. Did he use them? No, he was smart enough to use a message that was wrapped in values that would resonate with the American public.
So maybe pointed to those kinds of lists or facts, or to think about them, but
right,
not actually just read a laundry list of things.
Right, right. And that's what progressives and liberals are caught in, the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was a period from the 1650s maybe up to the late 1700s. It was a wonderful time. We realized that human beings could think, they could rationally make decisions. It was able to get the earth out of the center of the universe, as the Catholic Church had been preaching. Copernicus had a hard time with that. The church didn't like it. But it also did away with the divine right of kings, right? So we didn't have God choosing kings and queens, and their edicts were, of course, the voice of God manifest on earth, but we could actually make our own decisions. We could have democratic republics. We could have parliamentary forms of government. That was wonderful. But the outlying sort of message from the Enlightenment is that we are all rational. Therefore, if we set 60 people in a room, present them with a problem, and give them the same objective, verifiable set of facts, they would all come to the same conclusion about what's the best solution to that problem. That isn't the way we
Doesn't
work.
work that way.
No. The truth will not set us free. That's the problem liberals have and progressives have. They say, if we just put enough facts in front of you, you've got to see the truth. It's impossible for you
Yes.
not to see the light, and that doesn't work.
Okay. What about demographic differences in terms of like ages, young, old, male, female, rich, poor?
Yeah. You've got to know your target audience. Every presenter understands you've got to know your target audience. So if I am presenting, for instance, a program to a conservative group of union people, and there are conservative union people out there, I will frame my presentation differently than if I'm talking to people who I all think are on the same bandwagon with me. So you have to tailor it, but you're always trying to build a values bridge. And the values bridge, as I preach it, is going to deal with fairness and justice, and it's going to be wrapped in the American flag. We're going to go back. What's the one story we hear in grade school and hear repeated over and over and over again about the history of the United States? It's the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. It's our founding fathers. It's our founding values. So when you are reaching out to people and you want to get a message across and you want to build a values bridge, that's the best place to start. And conservatives are wonderful at this. When I listen to AM talk radio, I can't go a half hour without hearing sub-reference to our founding fathers or founding values, and how progressives are just an abomination to those values. We need to be eliminated because we do not hold those dear. And there are two authors, a guy named Nick Hanauer and Eric Liu, who have written two books. One's called The Garden of Democracy, the other is called The True Patriot. And in both those books, they say liberals and progressives are silly to have abandoned founding values and founding fathers to conservatives. Our values are just as tied to those events as conservative values are.
Okay. How do you analyze a message outside your own comfort zone? I mean, in terms of what... Our brains
are hardwired for stories. They are instantly able to turn a picture into a story. Our brains are hardwired for stories for a number of reasons, but it's a survival mechanism. Humans have been on Earth for 100 to 150,000 years, depending upon your point of view. Cave drawings go back maybe 40,000 years, but the written language goes back 5. So when we told our kids, stay away from that shiny rock at noon, it's for your own safety because there's this big animal back there that will eat you. Those children who couldn't remember stories didn't survive to have kids. So we are hardwired for stories, and we've got to get our story out there. And those stories are told, to unpack them. We automatically turn things into stories, so we got to figure out, to unpack that, what happened in our brains instantly, is we got to figure out what the problem is. We got to figure out what values are involved, values are at risk. We've got to figure out who the villains, victims, and heroes are in that story that we made up in our head. We've got to decide where the intervention should take place and who should intervene. And all those things happen all the time. I have a picture that I use in one of my classes of a tick on the arm of a human being, and the word union is on the tick. Now, it's a visual message, and everybody in the room automatically, even though they're union people, understand the story. Your life is at risk, the life of America is at risk because of unions. The people who are union people are the villains, the American people are the victims, and the heroes will be anybody who chooses to intervene and smash unions, right? So we need to be able to unpack that, figuring out what the issue is, what the values are, villains, victims, and heroes, where to intervene, when to intervene, how to intervene.
Okay. Do you think that this presidential election time period that we're in right now, has that changed? Have we changed the way messages are framed, or are we seeing anything different? We keep hearing from people, this is a completely different kind of election. Everything's changed. So do you think so?
I look at 2008 and I look at this year, and I see Barack Obama being somebody who would play to values and messages and use the bully pulpit well. I see Secretary of State Clinton still doing the rational I have this program, it'll benefit you. I have this program, it'll benefit you. Where's the overarching value frame in which these programs fit? There was, at one time in '08, a Christmas message that Barack and his family and Hillary gave to the people of Iowa because their caucuses were coming up. And President Obama's message at Christmas was, "Thank you so much for the hospitality. You've welcomed myself and my wife and my family into your homes." Right? There's the values bridge.
Right.
You were decent people. I really appreciate that. The ad that Hillary had was she was in front of a desk and there were wrapped Christmas presents on the desk. And she said, "Oh, let's see what we have for Iowans this year. Oh, well, we're going to give you a better quality education." And she'd pull another one over, right? And so she was going through a laundry list of programs thinking that Iowans, especially those who were undecided, were going to be attracted to that laundry list. I think she's doing much the same thing now, and she would be wiser to find a way to get that overarching sort of frame in which all these things fit.
Okay, so I kind of hear you saying we're kind of in the same mode. The conservative message.
The conservatives are doing a very good job of wrapping, well, Donald Trump is a force unto himself. I've never seen anything quite like Donald. He was nailed for being on both sides of an issue on more than one occasion. He says, "You don't understand, all my things are just suggestions. They're not position statements, they're just suggestions. I want to see what works. I'm a businessman." And that allows him to get away with lots of stuff.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking about political messaging, about how the brain works, and it's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for your interest. I'm sorry I ranted forever and ever, but that's what I do.
Thank you. For the League of Women Voters, I'm Geri Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues and the candidates, and at election time, go vote, Omaha.